Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio Live, exclusively on kGRADB, the Global Radio Alliance. Thanks for staying with us. Before we begin hour two of tonight's interview with Scott Portzline, it's time for the news, and it's brought to us by earthfiles.com. Linda?
Thank you, Race. A couple of years ago, in the fall of 2015, one of the big solar system mysteries came from NASA's Dawn spacecraft that flew over the dwarf planet Ceres between Mars and Jupiter. There was a crater called Akator in the Ceres northern hemisphere that gleamed with bright white spots that some people were comparing to bright lights in some kind of Earth city like Las Vegas. But when spectroscopy results were finally in, scientists concluded that those bright, mysterious white spots were apparently magnesium sulfate, similar to Epsom salts on Earth. Now, recent data suggests that the white spots are on top of pools of salty water underground, which could be the remnants of an ancient ocean that was somehow warm enough to flow beneath the dwarf planet's surface and maybe even on top of it. Recently, planetary scientist Nathan Stein at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena said, quote, "It's possible there is still brine, the salty water, coming up from underground to the surface in the crater and leaving those bright white magnesium sulfate salts. It certainly is intriguing what keeps the salt so fresh and bright," close quote. Beyond the Akator crater, Professor Stein's research team has found some 300 other bright patches all over Ceres. This is the most reflective material, and it lies at the bottom of many craters like Akator. Planetary geologist Lene Quick, PhD of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., has wondered what the source of so many and varied bright spots all over Ceres could be. And she says, quote, "We believe these bright spots are a sign that Ceres once did have a global ocean around the entire dwarf planet. In fact, what the Dawn spacecraft has photographed on Ceres since 2015 may also be occurring on a larger scale on the icy moons of the outer solar system, such as Jupiter's icy moon Europa and Saturn's big ice fountains on Enceladus," close quote. Briny water could have been pushed up through ground fractures to the surface. And also, meteorites could slam into the ground and squeeze icy brine to the surface. That makes sense in craters like Akator, where the white, bright spots are only in the bottom of the crater. Dr. Quick thinks that the silver metallic-looking Ahuna Mons mountain is actually a pile of icy lava that literally boiled out, forming the big, shiny mountain. All of these brine and icy lava eruptions have happened in just the past tens of millions of years, which could mean that Ceres is not a dead dwarf planet at all, but is still active and full of mysteries today in our 4.6 billion year old solar system. This is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earth Files news updates on KGRA Radio and visit every day my science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more on breaking stories about our universe, this solar system, and the planet we live on.
And that's the news, brought to you by earthfiles.com. Thank you, Linda. Now back to the program.
Thank you, Race. And Scott, what you were saying before the break about tests that have been reported publicly being very, very small, not a reality check on 150 kilotons or even 30 megaton nuclear weapons that we know that we have and some of the larger nations. Do you know what percentage are in that 30 megaton and how we would talk about what 30 megatons would do to any city or area, and how unfair it is for the government to do teeny tests out in Area 51 and say that some of the big consequences of 30 megatons we've never even heard about.
Yes, I don't know the percentages of the 30 megaton weapons. We can actually go the whole way up to 50 megatons. But having been to the U.S. Army War College on a public discussion of nuclear weapons and why the military wants so many weapons. You know, we used to have 22,000 nuclear weapons. Now we're down to 5,000 that we admit to. But the military wants to have any size weapon it needs and the capability to use it anywhere in the world, because not all places in the world are easily struck by our missiles due to orbital mechanics and the limitations of our launch sites. So the military came up with a fabulous nuclear bomb technique called dial-a-yield. And what that means is they take a fusion bomb, and in the base of it, of the bomb itself, they have tritium gas, and a way to control the amount of tritium gas that they add to the blast. They inject this tritium gas, which is radioactive, and it causes the yield to be variable from 300 kilotons up to 50,000 megatons. Now, I don't know if that's a fact for all sizes of bombs, but using dial-a-yield, it gives them that type of a range.
Now,
so we might have 4,000 of those. Well, that's enough to destroy the Earth.
Wow. Now, let's go back to the nuke map where we had 150 kilotons in Honolulu that we were using as an exercise. What would happen if it was a 30 megaton?
Well, at Honolulu, the whole island of Oahu would be covered by that thermal radiation. So pretty much, unless you're in some of the nooks and crannies of those valleys in the mountainous region, you're going to be burned up. A 30 mega...
The whole island would be a hurt. Entire Oahu.
Yeah. Honolulu itself, the fireball with, let's see, I have 30,000 tons. Okay. Let me be sure I got this right. I think I got it right. Yeah. The whole center of Honolulu would be vaporized from between that Diamond Head and the airport. Nearly all of that district would be gone. And the fatalities would be 562,000. But if we look at that same type of, and I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. At least I'm trying to get there. Whoops. I'm going to plug that in. I looked at it the other day. The blast effects range almost to Baltimore.
Wow.
Yeah, it's bad. In fact, I had to zoom out on my map to see it. Yeah, that thermal line, the biggest circle, goes from Fredericksburg, Maryland, just about, to Baltimore, Maryland.
And Scott, they say that the average time that would be given from a real missile alert might be only 15 minutes. So
yeah, less than that.
30. Yeah, what are they going to do?
Huh. Well, it'll be failure if it's from a nuclear submarine sitting off the coast of Washington, D.C. in the Atlantic. It'd actually be off the coast of Delaware. It's 8 minutes, 8-minute flight time from the launch. Well, it's going to take the first 5 minutes to determine that this is a real threat. Now you have 3 minutes to take cover. You won't even have time to run down the steps in your office building, let alone get on the elevator and wait for it because everybody else is calling for it also.
So the majority of people, wherever there was a real, honest-to-God nuclear missile alert, they really almost have to stay where they are and hope that they had thought about this and had something that, a plan wherever they work, live, or whatever. You've got to think in terms of where my life goes every day. What could I do to prepare myself so that in 5 to 15 minutes, I might have a chance to get down to a basement and have my iPhone in a bag that would protect it?
Yeah, that's a really good yardstick to use, 5 to 15 minutes. And so people need to plan to be able to run a couple of blocks probably at most. And I don't even think I would try to drive because uh, it just takes everybody else doing the same thing to tie up the roads very rapidly. And then if you do that, you also leave your unmovable car, at least easily moved car, in the streets. So, for instance, when I started talking about the Mechanicsburg Naval Base earlier, one person told me that one of the things they have inside that building underground are thousands of huge trucks with plows on them to be able to plow open the major roads so the military can pass through.
Meaning plowing cars with dead people in them.
Exactly, or just the cars, but there'll be dead people too.
Wow. Well, can we now try to unfold more about what is in the news? And I have a feeling that it is going to be pushed by the Trump administration hard, and that is Pentagon suggests countering devastating cyber attacks with nuclear arms. What do you think, if this goes forward and this becomes American policy, what is the increase in odds that we will end up in some kind of a nuclear exchange if this is passed and becomes law?
Well, if we stay on hair trigger alert, to me, it's almost a certainty within, say, 30 years. That's kind of a long time. It's so hard to project on it because we need to count on cooler heads to prevail. It's so difficult to ascertain where a cyber attack has come from. That takes time. And due to stressors and the current world situations at that time, there may be somebody say, we can't wait. We've got to attack now. And we're pretty sure that so-and-so nation did this. And yet we could be fooled. The military grade hacks are a whole nother level. Things that people aren't even aware of can be done.
Like?
Well, it happened to me. Not a military attack, but a governmental attack using some military grade cyber tactics. I'll give you two examples. Do you remember the fellow named Ed Dames?
Yeah.
And he does remote viewing.
Right.
And he was paid by the government, the military, to do that. I guess it was 2002 or thereabouts. He was predicting through remote viewing that some terrorists were going to use a submarine to attack the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant on the coast of California, and that they were going to come down from northern part of the United States in the Pacific and sit off the coast and strike it with some sort of rocket-propelled grenades or some sort of weapons and take out the plant, cause a nuclear meltdown that would release radiation from west to east, as you pointed out earlier. Well, it turned out that, of course, this wasn't true, but the government got tired of him making these predictions and stirring up trouble. So I had some friends in Washington, D.C., who were heavily involved in nuclear proliferation and nuclear power terrorism and around the world, sabotage and terrorism. And I got a call from him saying, tonight at midnight, Ed Dames' website is going to be taken down because he won't stop saying these things. And sure enough, when I got on the website early the next morning, it said FUBAR, which is a military term for something being messed up beyond all repair. And he fell in the blank there. And sure enough, the government did that. And he quit doing ridiculous, scary warnings like that, at least for that time. I don't know what he's been up to recently. But the one that happened to me was involved with surveillance that I was going through at the time. Dirty bombs was a big concern. We had terrorists threaten the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on the 18th of October, 2001, 1 month after September 11th. We had a terrorist training camp 20 miles from my home for Al-Qaeda with Ramzi Youssef and his men in near New Bloomfield, Pennsylvania. And these men were the same men who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993. So I had been involved with federal hearings and knew quite a bit about nuclear terrorism with nuclear plants and lost and stolen nuclear materials to make dirty bombs. So I was being surveilled, and every now and then the government would do something called shaking the tree, which means they deliberately let you know in some clever ways that they are watching you to see how you respond. And that's shaking the tree. I'm going to shake the tree and see what happens, see what falls out. So maybe my response would be, if I'm up to no good, a person up to no good would call their compatriots and say, hey, lay low, don't call me for a month. I'll get in touch with you, but we got to lay low right now. Well, then they know they really need to keep a better eye on you. And so what happened to me was the one day I was down at 3 Mile Island doing some video of the security and just watching, as I would do every few months. And I'd been doing that prior to 9/11 also. Well, Al-Qaeda did the same thing. They were at 3 Mile Island doing some surveillance also the months before the 9/11 attacks. And when I got home from that trip, I had an email, and it said, you better, I don't want to reveal too much because people could try to trick me by repeating, but it said to the effect, I better say my prayers, and then it named an object that was in the back seat of my car. A normal everyday object that people have, but nonetheless a little bit unique. So again, I don't want to give away what that object was. And the message had absolutely no computer information on it. You could not tell where it came from, what time there was nothing. You know how there's a trail of data with even a photograph that you take nowadays with digital cameras. There was nothing on this email. So I sent it to the local reporter that for a newspaper that I had been working with on lots of stories for years. And he said, wow, I sent this to my IT people. I didn't even know this was possible. And then he got a phone call similar to what I got. No, he got an email similar to what was sent to me, doing the same thing to them. So they're just saying to him, yep, we're listening to everything you're doing and know everything. And that's what I mean by military grade.
Right.
They can spoof things. They can hide the fact that they've been there. The Stuxnet virus, which was at that time seen as a new level of attack, used what's called the man in the middle attack, where the virus sent signals to the centrifuges to spin faster than they were able to withstand, and so they would tear themselves to pieces. Yet the computer at the same time was sending signals to the controllers that the speed was normal. And that's the man in the middle, where they obfuscate what's really happening.
Wow. That it's how do they do that? I have understood just in the last 2 years, more than one person has told me that they've literally had, through whether it's satellite, they don't understand it, but their iPhone, they're working for an agency, and they have been working on something sensitive, and that after a threat, their whole entire iPhone was melted, and they don't know how.
Well, my first reaction is, lithium batteries are a bad thing at times, but I really don't know.
Something that maybe provokes them too, that they can do this with frequency as a target.
Well, I would not rule that out. I haven't heard of that technology, but certainly one of the examples that was given on what cyber hacks can do with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. I think that is what it's called, corporation, even though it's like a governmental body. They burned up a generator. They gave it certain commands and caused it to catch a fire as it overheated.
And on purpose.
Yeah, that was to demonstrate what could happen, and they publicized it.
Well, now, if we had a 30 megaton, what we were posing before the break, let's say on the West Coast, what is the calculated damage to the electric grid in the United States under the stress of something like a 30 megaton?
Well, if it were at altitude, it'd be half of the United States would be at risk. I don't know a lot about the EMP and as far as what the calculated risks are, but I do know this. Terrorists can make an EMP weapon. It doesn't have to be a nuclear bomb. It can be a homemade weapon using parts from office machines, a specific kind of office machine. It's one of the places you can get a very powerful unit that's perfect to create a electronic phenomenon that they need to detonate this electric bomb. In fact, as you know, there was a cover of Popular Mechanics magazine that was on the newsstands the month before the 9/11 attacks, saying that terrorists can build an E-bomb for $400.
I have that cover right in front of me that you sent from Popular Mechanics. It was the September 2001 issue, which means it came out somewhere at the end of August before 9/11. And here is the cover: Top Secret E-Bomb. The electromagnetic pulse bomb is unlike any other weapon in America's arsenal, reducing an enemy to Stone Age existence. Now the bad news: terrorists can build one for $400. Can you explain that more?
Well, what they would do is get some simple electronic components and assemble it properly. Involves coils of wires, and it's creating a magnetic field. And then the way EMPs work is pretty unique because they take advantage of physics that happen very rapidly and at the right time. And that's why you need a specific powerful electronic device. Powerful meaning not like strength and voltage, but powerful capability that is hard to get a hold of, except they're in many offices. The government doesn't want you to know about that, yet they publicize these types of things in Popular Science and Mechanics Illustrated. Sometimes I think both of those are shills for the Defense Department of Energy or Department of Defense, because those are the magazines that usually reveal the latest bombers that come out, the fighters and bombers and so forth, and weapons. You'll also see on that cover, right underneath that photograph, a new machine gun that can fire, 1 million rounds a minute or a second? What does it say? Do you have it there?
Plus a machine gun that fires 1 million rounds per minute.
There you go.
Good Lord. And that was the month before 9/11, and we're now at 2018. One of the areas that I think that we all should know more about is the electric grid. I have read a variety of reporters who have investigated that if we had a strong EMP, and let's say it was on the West Coast, and let's say it took down all of the electrical grid on the West Coast, that it has a domino effect because the entire power grid can only take so much, and it's like dominoes falling. Do you know what would happen if all of the power went down on the West Coast? Would it have that domino effect all the way across the U.S.?
No, because we do have our electrical system segmented into huge regions. So, no, it would not cascade to that degree. But as we saw in the that pretty much started in Ohio. And can you hear me, Linda? Linda, can you hear me?
It dropped out. It dropped out. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, continue.
All right. So we had this blackout. I think it was the year 2004. It started in Ohio and cascaded up into Canada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, and I think it went to New York City even. But what happened there, because of the regions being able to be somewhat segregated, they were able to control it. But it didn't take long, just a matter of minutes, for it to cascade that to that degree. That one, by the way, I still really believe was a cyber attack, because the people that saw it begin were watching their computer monitors, and they said all of a sudden the data went all squirrely. Instead of sending numbers that were squirrely, all the data was squirrely. Instead of a number being there, it was computer symbols and digits and letters, and you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And I think our government will never admit to things like that. And by the way, at that time, there were 6 other attacks in Europe I think 6 other attacks in about a 2-month period. So that just said to me, somebody's showing off.
Well, this whole question of sabotage, cyber attacks fall into that category too. But you've done a lot of work on evidence that even 3 Mile Island might have been by sabotage.
Yes. And the reason I got suspicious of that is, as I mentioned earlier, I was in Thule, Greenland in 1979. The 3 Mile Island accident emergency, is how I prefer to say it, began on the 28th of March while I was up in Greenland. And when I came home, I asked some of my good friends, and I was pro-nuclear at that point, what happened? And some of them were saying it might have been sabotage. There was some newspaper articles, they were telling me, in the Paxton Herald, which is a weekly paper, which is more about community events and chicken barbecues, that sort of thing, than hard news. But on the cover of the newspaper, and I will show you someday, it says that there was a cult in the Harrisburg area. Don't forget, this is 1979 when this happened. 78 was when the newspaper came out, saying that a cult in Harrisburg was planning to sabotage 3 Mile Island, and that the newspaper was requesting security at the plant be doubled, and that the police better pay attention, and the federal authorities and so forth. Well, I never forgot that. In 1984, it's 5 years later, I'm reading the newspaper, and it says a cult located at 13th and Dairy Street, which is where I had a Boy Scout troop, was arrested, these 4 cult members, for having sex with children. And that's when it hit me, oh my gosh, there's a cult in my hometown. Now, you got to remember, Jim Jones was the only cult people really heard of at that point. Jim Jones had just happened in 1978, where they killed 1,000 people in former French Guiana, I think it was, South America anyway. And no one would have believed there was a cult in their hometown. Yet, the next memory was, my gosh, my one Boy Scout wasn't making this stuff up. He was about 14 years old. I still see him. I talk to him about every 3 or 4 days. He was telling us how these women at that home in that report wanted to have sex with him, wanted to take photographs, and he could live there if he wanted to, and they would feed him and so forth. And we thought he was making it up. And then when I found out that it was true, boy, did I ever learn not to ignore anything anybody says, no matter how crazy it is. At least give it a second thought. And then if it really is crazy, dismiss it. But sometimes people are telling you the truth when it's something you don't know about. And then the third thought that came to my head was, wow, there's a cult that was supposedly going to sabotage TMI. I'm going to find out if that's plausible. So instead of looking into the cult evidence, which I didn't know where to start for that, I went to the library, and within 30 minutes found that the President's Commission, with all of their investigators, they suspected sabotage because of the things that they were finding and the lack of quality investigation by the nuclear people, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And they sent a letter to the FBI, which I have copies of, and I have copies of the return letter from the FBI, saying that they want the FBI to investigate because they found some things that are unexplainable. In fact, I think I have it. I had the letter in front of me on another computer page. We can get to that another time.
Scott,
here it is.
Yeah, why would a cult want to sabotage 3 Mile Island?
Well, you're right. That's a more important issue to address. See, the cult was a little bit like the Heaven's Gate cult. Do you remember that suicide cult? And the guy called himself Doe, and his partner was T. And they believed that they would get to the next level above human by killing themselves. And that involved the Hale-Bopp comet. And people were trying to blame people like Art Bell for putting these ideas in their head. And Art Bell had nothing to do with that. He just talked about the Hale-Bopp comet. Well, they believe the UFO was behind that comet, and if they killed themselves, they would go aboard that UFO and advance to the next level above human. This cult here in Harrisburg, called the Neo-American Church, led by a fellow named George Fagley, and I have all the court records and documents. It's a fact. They believe that they would advance the next level above human by killing everybody else, and that disasters, whether they be man-made or natural, were designed to kill the unwanted. And you were unwanted. You didn't matter. You were considered inanimate if you weren't a member of their cult. So here's what happened, and the timing of it is very, very suspicious, and even caused the NRC to suspect sabotage at one point. The arrest of George Fagley for the sex with the children in his church school at that address in Harrisburg that I talked about occurred on the 10th of April, 1975. The letters that went out that the Paxton Herald reported on their front page saying the cult was planning to sabotage actually said the 10th of April in 1979 is when this attack would take place. Why the 10th of April? It was the anniversary of George Fagley being arrested. And after all, he said the young girls voluntarily had sex, as they testified in court, that they didn't see it as sex abuse. They wanted to be his wives. And so the cult believed they were justified in their strange reasoning to take out the District of Harrisburg. And the letter advised everybody who was a member of the cult and your loved ones be warned to leave the District of Harrisburg, because after sunset on the 10th of April, it will become uninhabitable. And then it gave geographic descriptions from the Swatara Creek and the courthouse and all this. Well, I have those letters. And then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was real concerned about it. I should add this fact. So why did the accident happen on the 28th? Because the Paxton Herald published a letter, and now their plan has been exposed. The cult leader changed the date of the attack to the anniversary of startup of TMI, which was to the minute 1 year before. The accident happened to the minute of the anniversary. And we know that many attacks and saboteurs pick a date with some significance to their ideology.
Well, it was a meltdown, or at least a big partial meltdown in Unit 2. How would a cult, if they were doing sabotage, how would they accomplish that?
Well, I'm going to give you two different types of answers. One would be the technical answer, and the other, the manipulation. See, they were, I'm trying to be concise because I have so much knowledge about it, and there's certain things I don't want to say publicly because they're frankly still a little bit dangerous to say. But the cult was supplying children to some important people here in Harrisburg, which is the state capital. And that's the part I want to get into details. The cult had some very educated people, including engineers. One of my friends was an engineer, and his buddy was arrested by the state police as being in that cult, and they were checking to see how far the reaches went, and to see if my buddy was also in this cult. The adults associated with the cult were having sex with children. So you can easily blackmail someone who works at 3 Mile Island to get the accident started. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened, because they were able to start it technically to the minute of when they wanted it to begin by throwing a switch on the back of something called a condensate polishers, where the problems began. And I could go into a lot of technical information there as to why the NRC's investigation of that came up lacking by far. These are things that I've shown to David Lochbaum and Arnie Gunderson, two nuclear engineers and scientists who were involved with the 3 Mile Island court cases. And they both said the same thing. My goodness, you are showing me things that I did not know. Well, I've done 40,000 pages of research in that emergency. And believe me, there's several 100,000 of pages that exist. And it takes a lot of time, and someone who has the capability to do that because most people were far busier with other matters. This was one of the most important things to me because I felt like I was solving a puzzle that I had bumped into by accident with that Boy Scout and the cult right there near the Boy Scout troop, being in Greenland and coming home to find out these rumors were probably true. And when I was in Greenland, by the way, I snuck into the radar site, one of the most intensely guarded, supposedly, places in the world, the main radar site for the Dew Line in Thule, Greenland. I walked right in. So I knew how easy it was to get into places like 3 Mile Island.
Wow. And this was the worst nuclear event in the United States to date.
Well, that's what we believed at that point. But the accident at the meltdown at Santa Souza, I'm not sure how you say it, or St. Souza, Rocketdyne on the West Coast, not too far from Los Angeles, may have actually been worse. And Dan Hirsch from the Committee to Bridge the Gap, who's also concerned about sabotage and terrorism and knows me fairly well, he has some very convincing documentation that that event was even bigger than 3 Mile Island. What we think happened with sabotage here at 3 Mile Island was the saboteurs did enough to get things started, but didn't do enough to actually make a meltdown. So whoever that person was, and I have a good idea, was fulfilling his contract, so to speak, of the blackmail being pressured on him by the cult leader, and doing enough to get started, but not enough to make a meltdown happen, to fulfill his human beliefs, rather than he didn't really have the hardcore beliefs of going to the next level above human. So what happened, I'll give you a few other techno events. Somebody pulled wires off of the back of the condensate polishers on 5 of the 8 units. If you pull off 5, those will not work again. And the NRC didn't even report that, but the President's Commission investigators did. And in fact, a memo I retrieved at the National Archives says, I don't know how well these NRC investigators look, but from what we're seeing, they don't look good. They're really coming up short. So that would be another explanation of why they couldn't get the condensate polishers to reestablish the flow of coolant through the reactor systems. That would actually have been the secondary system. The main one, though, that the President's Commission looked into was some emergency feed water valves which were shut off, and it was never explained adequately why they were shut off. So the letter to the FBI says the commission cannot pursue this issue thoroughly, and they were talking about those closed valves. But we believe that the FBI should and can undertake such an investigation. And then the President's Commission Chairman John Kemeny signs the letter. As instructed by vote of the President's Commission, I request the assistance of the FBI in this matter. So I have recordings and conversations with other initial investigators who also suspected sabotage right from the beginning. And I have a great deal more technical evidence and a great deal more activities by the suspects and their actions right before the meltdown. They left the area, and people started phoning the Paxton Herald saying, my gosh, it's about to happen. They've left now. And sure enough, another reporter out near the Pittsburgh area caught wind of this a few years later and has recordings of the children. They had left to West Virginia, and the children said in their home in West Virginia, there were maps of the Harrisburg area with 3 Mile Island circled and concentric circles with the estimations of the radiation that would be released. And so even the kids in the cult knew what was going on.
Wow. And this also brings up this issue that we have touched on, which is things like suitcase nukes. And you said something when we were talking about this earlier, that you would not be surprised if the North Korean leader actually tried to get something into the United States through, let's say, a shipping vessel or airplane or something that would be smaller and not the big ballistic missile.
Yes, right. And while the United States might start spending billions of dollars again on a Star Wars defense plan, which just inherently can't work, because it's easily overcome by decoy missiles and decoy re-entry vehicles, numbering into the tens of thousands, which is overload the system. North Korea is, I call them a tunneling nation. They've made thousands of tunnels so that they can attack South Korea someday and hide in these tunnels in North Korea if they are attacked. They're going to do something more subtle. They're going to probably try to distribute all across our nation some suitcase nukes or shipping vessel nukes, that sort of thing. And because the government in the past, the U.S. government, has only been able to survey with proper electronic equipment shipping containers at the rate of 2%. That means even if we were claiming to do 90%, even that wouldn't be accurate. There's no way they're going to be able to have the time to look at every single container. Can you imagine working at a shipping yard and having to go through every container and get a good scan, and what it would take to get a good scan on everything you're doing? It's just human nature that you would bypass some of the things or not give it a second try.
But isn't the UK, at least according to some articles in the New York Times since this discussion about the proposal that we would do nuke attacks if we had cyber hacking, that it's come up that the UK is so concerned about something like a nuke coming in containers that they are using at least the term of approximately 100% of the shipping coming into the UK that they're now trying to investigate. What would the UK be using differently than what we are doing?
Well, it's just size. I mean, when you look how small the United Kingdom is compared to the United States and how many points of entry there are from ports where shipping vessels come in, it's much easier to do that. And they certainly don't have the manufacturing capabilities that we do. Actually, I'm arguing against that point because that would require them to have more imports than we do, where we, well, at least in the past, we didn't need to import as much. I guess we're not manufacturing as much now. Sorry, I don't really know too much about what the United Kingdom's doing, but I'm thinking it's the size advantage that they have.
Mm-hmm. And how important do you think, just everything you've been exposed to in your life and investigations, how important do you think it would be now for the CIA, NSA, DIA, NRO, and all of the alphabet soup to be able to be screening everything everywhere?
Oh, we'd have to. Oh, the expense that would be involved with that and the manpower is tremendous. But even then, it just doesn't matter because a fishing vessel and North Korean fishing vessel and so forth could come across and not even check into a port, just do it. Well, what's happened in Japan and South Korea, North Korean vessels would land and kidnap people or just harass security perimeters, even at a nuclear plant in South Korea. 4 commandos in a rubber raft type setting came ashore right outside a nuclear plant. And it's all part of harassment and shaking the tree, see what the other country does in response.
Well, clearly the North Korean leader is shaking the tree of the United States and the world, or trying to. What if you were just saying from an educated point of view, what the likelihood is that this guy might try to launch a 150 kiloton nuclear missile at us? Do you think that's likely or not?
I personally don't, but there's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who for years do think that's a likelihood. I've always heard, even in the 90s, that of all the nations that were feared the most by people within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it was the crazy people in North Korea. Now we have 2 world leaders, Donald Trump and President of Korea, I always forget his name.
Kim Jong-un.
No wonder I forget it. But nice haircut, by the way. Both of them, nice haircuts. They are very braggadocious and a lot of bravado. So I compare it to 2 neighbors that are arguing and side by side, and they're looking over the fence at each other and holler, and they've poured gasoline in their yards, and so it's a foot deep. and they're walking around with matches. And now it's to the point we have these two leaders who are also smoking big cigars with this gasoline all over and bragging about how tough they are, and their cigars bigger than that. That's where we're at. That's very, very sad. Even though I paint a picture that's like a Dr. Strangelove movie, that's sad. I want to tell you about something else that really worries me, because I would regret it if I didn't. And that was the drones that were flying over the French nuclear plants a few years ago. The military couldn't catch them. These were very sophisticated drones that would shine a light down onto the nuclear plants. And it even prompted warnings from several governments, the United Kingdom included, saying that they know that ISIS has been trying to militarize their drones and are thinking of using them to attack nuclear plants or to disperse radioactive materials in Europe. The same thing happened in Belgium, which is, a neighbor to France. So this one, you can read about that. There's a lot of reports. They never figured out who did it. They took into temporary custody some people from Greenpeace, but the Greenpeace people had nothing to do with it. At least that's what they claim, and I believe them. It looks pretty accurate, because these were some sophisticated drones. It happened at least, I think it was 22 occasions, and they could never catch them.
That you're aware of.
Well, that's true. I've tried to contact a reporter from France who's interviewed me on issues here in the United States, and I just haven't been able to get through to her.
I've listened. I've listened. You're got a lot of information. It's important, but this is the same kind of stuff that was being talked about in the 60s. And the bomb shelters, the underground shelters. As a child, I had to, practice going under a desk, and, we were close to nuclear war, with Kennedy and Khrushchev, but it never happens. And I'm not saying that something couldn't happen, but it just seems to me that the countries, as much as they run their mouths and everything, and I think a lot of it has to do with just defense budgets and keeping people scared, that the people that are behind the scenes that understand realize that you can't win. It's like the movie, what was it, the one where the kid hacked into NORAD and the computer actually did a nuclear.
Was that War Games?
Yeah. And at the end, the computer came to realize it doesn't matter. You can't win. The world's gone. So I guess my point is that I believe that people should be somewhat prepared. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But at the end of the day, what do you really think these people are stupid enough? Because they're going to die just like the rest of us.
Well, there's two answers I want to give to that. I'm saying that it's going to happen by accident, because we're on these hair trigger alerts. That circumstances will add up someday where there'll be at least an initial volley or nuclear response, even if it means just one weapon being launched from a B-52 or a submarine, a cruise missile, whatever. But then we have the other answer involving nations like India and Pakistan, where Pakistan, their belief system is vastly different than ours. They've stated that they have the Islama bomb, they call it, and that if they lose every single person in Pakistan, it doesn't matter. That if they attack India and they completely wipe out their own country, it's still a victory to them. So when you consider, there are some places where the leaders don't have the same conscious thought, and that mutually assured destruction doesn't mean a thing to them, doesn't work, that becomes a possibility. I don't think that North Korea is going to deliberately launch a nuclear weapon against us. I could see where to harass us, they might do something on the ground, but as soon as we figure out who's done it, with these shipping vessels or containers, as soon as we figure out who's done it, they disappear.
Well, you're kind of describing the Clancy, series, and the final one came out right after 9/11 called Sum of All Fears. And the guy talks a lot, but it doesn't just have a problem with us. China doesn't want things to go south either. I think they want to survive too. So, if you try to stunt, You have to understand, being from the military for 27 years, I spent a year in Korea. We have contingency plans that'll never be discussed, but they really do train on these scenarios and how to react and respond. And ultimately, people run around and talk about how Trump acts crazy. Trump's not going to do anything unless the military tells him what needs to be done. And it goes back the other way. If he gives an unlawful order, the military's not going to respond, against his order. I mean, there is checks and balances in place, and it's not the fact that something couldn't happen, but it never has, and let's just hope it never does.
Well, don't forget, with North, I agree mostly with everything you're saying and the principles that you're saying. I definitely agree with. But you got to remember, the leader of North Korea, he is a god. In his mind and in his nation, he is a god. So whatever he determines is okay. So if he wants to chain 13 people to a radiator, or if he wants to burn down Waco, that's what cult leaders do. And that's pretty much what Kim Jong-il, or whatever his name is, that's his mindset. Yeah, he can reason when he wants to, but he's starving and enslaving his whole nation. So what is he capable of? He could have a doomsday mindset that we don't know about, or maybe it'll happen in his later years, as happened to David Koresh, as happened to Jim Jones. We just don't know.
Well, that's true, but I mean, again, intelligence-wise, it's failed, no doubt, and that'd be another whole show. But I mean, when you make yourself that well known, he's being watched from a lot of different areas. And just remember, too, even though he is the leader, the military still has a lot of say over there, and there's people inside there that don't want to die any more than anybody else does.
I agree with your principles. I don't really know how accurate you can describe that. I'm, again, going on a micro scale. You had 13 children. 2 of them escaped, 1 turned back. That's 2 of them went out the window, and the 1 turned back because they were so afraid, and the other one successfully alerted. What I'm talking about is mind control and belief systems. And belief systems don't have to make sense. They just have to be afraid and think that dying is the best thing.
Oh, well, I don't disagree with that either, but I just believe that we've been staring down this threat since the 40s, and we're still here. And there are crazy people out there, and let's just pray that our intelligence and the people that are, sworn an oath to protect our country and the world can continue to stay ahead of them, I think, at the end of the day, because ultimately a small event will survive, but if it starts to escalate, it's over, and it won't matter how much food I've got in my basement or whatever else I have. The only people that might survive are the military people and the people that would get to these deep underground shelters and areas that they have. But even then, what are they going to have left, after everything is up to Earth? If it doesn't destroy the Earth itself, it will be inhabitable anyway.
Yeah. The continuity of government underground installations. In 1988, there were 9 big ones. And when CNN did an investigation with using backlighted men, there were 2 who said that they had worked on the construction of one of the big underground installations in the continuity of government under the National Programming Office, and that the government that would be taken down into the COG-NPO would not be the elected officials. It would be a whole different lineup from the intelligence world.
Yes. I want to add that I really did this show to talk about preparedness and not make projections into the future of what would happen. So I was asked for my personal opinion, but I don't have any special powers, especially when it comes to military actions. I do have a lot of knowledge about sabotage and terrorism of nuclear power plants, but I think what I'm saying is what's most likely to happen is a nuclear war will start by accident unless we take our weapons around the world, other nations, off of hair trigger. And that's a reasonable request.
And then,
well, I was just going to say we're out of time, but you're right. But the problem is the reason why they've always been on hair triggers because each side doesn't totally trust each other. So until the world and that's the people of the world, not the military people themselves, decide that we want to stop fighting and we can get along and trust each other enough not to want to blow us up, how many million times over if we really did have the exchange. There's always going to be weapons on hair trigger response, and we just have to hope and pray that whatever above us keeps that from ever taking place.
Oh, I agree. Even if the nation said they're not on hair trigger, you better believe they still have some on hair trigger. I know that.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed listening to you tonight.
Yes, thank you, John.
Thank you. And hopefully we can get people to get prepared better.
Yes, that was the goal tonight.
Well, I guarantee you I'm going to, for a fact. For John Burroughs, for Linda Moulton Howe, for our very special and honored guest, thank you, Scott Portzline, for coming on the program. And thank all of you for listening. Stay tuned for 3 hours of Jimmy Church and Fade to Black Live. Tonight is Fader Night with open lines right here on your contact for the very best in paranormal talk radio on the World Wide Web. Before we go, I just want to say to everybody, we're all in this together. Take care of each other, love each other, and be tolerant. Have a great night and a great weekend, everybody.